Hello, my name is Ryan Arthur, and I'm here to present today the effects and evolution of civil rights in the United States post 1964. To begin, I would like to discuss the original civil rights movement and how it started and evolved and created legislative policies that would become integral to United States life. Original civil rights movement began around the 1950s and 60s as forms of organized protest in order to gain equal rights primarily for African American citizens and other minorities throughout the United States. Case studies have been made primarily looking at Mississippi, as the South and Mississippi in particular were known to be very resistant towards the change of civil rights. Now, these studies observed how the state and local governments responded to these protests, and in most cases they found that they were met with heavy resistance from white citizens, and despite the violent backlash from the resistance, the state and local governments did not respond, or they allowed it to continue. And in many cases, this changed after the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, although there were documented incidents well after the case. So, from examples of Mississippi, other researchers like to see how the federal government responded to these instances. And originally, the Kennedy administration pushed for voluntary desegregation, in which they didn't make any hard legislative policies demanding anti-discrimination among states, but they encouraged it. And the problem with that was many states did not volunteer to do so. So eventually, Kennedy's administration had to push for legislative changes, and around 1962 this occurred, as data shows that after that moment, the numbers of speeches containing civil rights advocacy and pushing for executive orders and legislative policies drastically increased as the civil rights movement began to better make their case and were met with more resistance. And eventually, this led to the heavy push for the legislation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Before getting into that importance of that act, we should see the tactics that the civil rights movement used and how they're important to their success and the legislative changes that came from it. Now, some researchers, particularly Andrews, found that the 3 or 4 main tenets that led to a social movement success were its size, mobility, federal response, and resistance. If a movement was large enough, it would gain attention. That's simple to understand. But what's also important was how strategic and mobilized they were in getting that attention and maintaining a positive image and pushing to increase their size even more, so therefore gaining more attention. And that thus the federal response was born from said attention, but one of the more controversial reasons he gave was the need for resistance, as he says that without some form of resistance, you could argue that no change was necessary if everyone was okay or flat out ignored the calls for change from the social group. So therefore, resistance is also a primary aspect to show the success of a social movement. Other researchers like to look at the civil rights movement because of how effective it was in bringing about policy change throughout America. Most social movements actually statistically do not succeed, especially to the level that the civil rights movement did. So researchers like to look and see why was this movement in particular so special, and many actually agree with Andrews in that its size, strategy through mobility, the federal response, and resistance in some cases helped bring attention and push for change. Now the change socially was not completely immediate, but the legislative changes that brought forth from it were very important and shaped the future of the United States. Now, we look to post 1964 and the passing of the Civil Rights Movement, Civil Rights Act of 1964. We look to Mississippi again, where Andrews did a case study looking at African American voter turnout in particular, and the success of African American candidates. And despite what many people would think, Mississippi did in fact change quite immediately after the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There was a drastic increase in African American voter registration and turnout, and eventually they reached the national average, or close to the national average. Thus, it was very successful in the end. Now, the other issue is how to imitate the civil rights movement to gain social reform. Many researchers find that pushing for legislative change is the true answer rather than simple protest, as if you only wish for social change through protest, you will not see a favorable outcome. Yet social movements that actually fight for legislative change succeed. But lastly, we can look at modern civil rights and how the civil rights movement has expanded beyond the usual tenets of race, religion, and national origin. Immigration has become a large issue, and civil rights groups have kind of begun to fight for them as well. There's also been a change where wage and economic issues have been included. And lastly, local and state governments have been far more helpful in achieving civil rights change.